Hey, welcome back everyone. Great segment in store. So first off, we're going to be talking about whether the Chinese Communist Party is creating these conflicts with India and other countries as a way to shift the focus away from its own domestic problems. We're also going to be talking with Michael Yon, and he's a war correspondent, and he was one of the journalists covering the Hong Kong protests. Now that said, folks, again, we have launched a Patreon, so if you want to show your support for this channel, please find the link to our Patreon in the description below. Also, every Sunday, we're going to be doing a live Q&A for our Patreon supporters. So that said, we've seen the Chinese Communist Party starting up conflicts with Taiwan, Japan, India, other countries. Why is it doing it at this current time? We're going to be going over some of the different points of data on this and painting the picture that I think, based on my analysis and the analysis of others, that China is very likely trying to shift blame away from its own domestic problems. So the Epoch Times has an analysis on this, which we'll go over first. It states that commentator Tong Jingyuan said that the CCP is currently facing multiple internal and external crises. First of all, the domestic epidemic situation has not been completely controlled with the virus. Although the first wave of outbreaks has passed, the epidemic situation has occurred from time to time. There are still local outbreaks, and the public health field is still under great pressure. On another point, China has suffered a double blow economically. The first blow was from the trade war with the United States and the U.S. economic sanctions now being imposed on Hong Kong. The second blow is from the economic depression caused from the new coronavirus, the CCP virus. Now, the emergence of the, quote, roadside booth economy, as it's being called, proves that the main economic engine in China is no longer sustainable for its economy. In addition to this, the current international environment in which the CCP is currently located is unprecedentedly isolated for the regime. Even after the June 4th movement and the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, the struggle within the Communist Party has reached an almost open level. It hasn't seen something like this since. Now, this analyst believes that under the influence of a series of internal and external crises, the Chinese Communist Party is prone to provoke border conflicts. Now, with reference to past events, the CCP has set off anti-Japanese demonstrations, created small frictions on the Diaoyu Islands, also called the Senkaku Islands, the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits, etc., in order to dress itself up as a regime in which the country's territorial sovereignty fights, shift the focus of domestic public opinion, and increase the legitimacy of the CCP. Now, this individual believes the conflict with India right now will not escalate into a full-scale war, and he explains. The CCP can itself choose to not escalate. They can escalate on the Indian side if China does not meet that escalation and will not go into a full-scale war. And he also believes that China would be unlikely to escalate with India even for practical reasons. Now, India's mountain army capabilities are at least as good as the Chinese Communist Party's. And India could also draw on allies from the United States and even Russia. Now, the other interesting part is why the Chinese Communist Party did not release the full numbers of casualties during this controversial border crisis with India. You might remember seeing numbers. The Chinese regime allegedly killed about 20 Indian soldiers. When the Chinese Communist Party came out to talk about their losses, they said they were not going to disclose them. Why would they do that? Because information being released always serves the interests of the CCP. It is strategic. If it was in the interest of the CCP to release the numbers, they would release them. If it's in the interest of the CCP to hold those numbers, they will hold them. Now let's look at a few different pieces of this before we jump into the broader analysis. So first off, the public response from the CCP appears to align with this assessment. Now, some of the CCP's main outlets of information, including statements from its official spokespersons and from the main mouthpiece news outlets of the regime, including Xinhua, CCTV, and really most other outlets controlled or influenced by it, it has not really tried to escalate the situation. ABC in Australia reported that one of the few hardline responses was from the Global Times. Its chief editor, Hu Xijin, wrote a commentary stating, quote, "China does not want to escalate conflicts with India, but we have sufficient capacity to repel any provocation by the Indian army." So again, it's light and somewhat harsh. He's saying, yes, they can retaliate, but they don't want to retaliate. Now, it appears the CCP has not been able to de-escalate this issue as well, though, regardless of the overall relatively muted response to the incident from CCP officials in most of its news outlets. Now, emphasizing how this has escalated on the Indian side, the Hindu reported this, quote, "For some square kilometers of land," this argument goes, "China has lost India strategically to the West." Really, they've lost all their support within India, and India is now pivoting more towards the United States and the Western world. Now, India, meanwhile, is viewing this conflict, viewing this recent incident, as China seeing India as an economic competitor. Now, you might remember some of this different analysis saying China is projected to become one of the world's largest economies, and India is also projected about on that same trajectory. Now, in India, this is also being seen as the CCP equivalent to the Soviet Union's, quote, salami strategy. The CCP's version of this is called the cabbage strategy. And those are kind of goofy names, but hear me out. Basically, these strategies look to seize territory, to seize different areas through, say, a circular method. They will go in layers. In the South China Sea, for example, the CCP used the cabbage strategy, where they sent in first, say, fishing boats to create one layer, then Coast Guard ships to create another layer, then, say, these military islands they built to create a third layer, and then eventually military ships to guard those as a fourth layer. The initial strategy was just the fishing boats. And so when the CCP looks to seize territory, it's usually one small step that is not too controversial, then another ring to protect that layer, and then another one to protect that, and so on, until they've gained control of that whole area. India is looking at this border crisis like that. China might build a little camp, but the little camp can very quickly expand into a full base if they let it slide. Now, even if this is part of the CCP's strategy, it's possible they don't fully take into account how strong India's response would be. Now, let's take a look at how these things have developed on the Indian side. Now, anti-CCP protests are springing up in various parts of India and among Indian populations in other countries, even including in the United States. Now, economically, the incident is speeding up the push in India to decouple from China. It was already looking to pull its supply chain from China. You might remember stories, for example, about India even being willing to pay companies to pull out of China. This recent incident is adding extra fuel to that push. Also, Chinese companies are aware of the backlash. Some of them are even trying to hide their connections to China amid the blowback. And also, Chinese state media are trying to reel back the incident as well. They're claiming that the conflict shouldn't extend to areas of, say, business or of the Chinese tech expansion. And also in India, both among the government officials and Indian news outlets, they are launching investigations to expose Chinese corruption in the country. Now, so how should we understand what's taking place right now? For the Chinese Communist Party right now, they're facing a lot of external pressure and they're facing a lot of internal pressure. Now, inside of China right now, they're facing, say, economic turmoil. They're facing a lot of blowback from the Chinese people against authorities for the lockdowns, for other, say, totalitarian measures that have been taken. They're facing, say, even within their own party, low-level officials, say, struggling against higher-level officials. The amount of, say, breaking within the party ranks is becoming pretty large. And also at the social level, you're seeing a lot of blowback against the CCP. The CCP right now is not in a good state internally, at least for its own stability. And externally, many countries are pushing back against China. India, Japan were already looking to pull their supply chains out of China. The United States is talking about doing that. Many other countries are looking to investigate China, for example, for its handling of this virus. The CCP is facing sanctions on many different fronts right now. And so internally and externally, the CCP is facing crisis. So what is our assessment? Well, based on some of the sources we have at Epoch Times, this is how we're looking at it. The Chinese Communist Party's strategy, at least one of the ones being proposed, is they want to close the doors to the outside world amidst these growing attacks. They want to launch internally kind of a second cultural revolution. And if they can say there's enough pressure from the outside world, if other countries are really getting angry at China, they can use that in their internal propaganda. They can say the world is attacking China, the CCP needs to keep its borders closed in order to protect the Chinese people. Maybe they can reopen it again in 20 years. Now, this strategy is being proposed, at least according to some of our sources, from the hardline communists amongst the Chinese officials. It's not the whole party. Now, another point of analysis on this in terms of why China is being so, aggressive in its diplomacy and in its actions is that this also aligns right now with the, say, policies of Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party. His policy is to show strength, to show the Chinese Communist Party's strength. For example, they have this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, where they're really not holding back at all in terms of their aggression with other countries. Now, this is opposed to the strategy of Deng Xiaoping during the period of, say, reform and opening up. When China, say, for example, put some of its businesses, took them out from military control, put them under the control of the State Council, and began this, say, illusion of opening up to the West. Deng Xiaoping's strategy was hiding strength. The CCP's assessment is that the CCP is now strong enough to demonstrate strength, and so Xi Jinping's push is part of that. So again, two different points of analysis, one from the Xi side, one from the hardliner communist elements within the Communist Party itself, each of which is proposing something different, but each of which seems to be fueling what we're seeing now on the surface. Now, that said, of course, we'll be following this issue as it develops. We'll be telling you at least what we're seeing here. Now, moving on to some stories outside of China, Italy right now is using its army to prevent residents from escaping virus isolation. Here's an article here. It says, quote, "The Italian army was sent to seal off a coronavirus hotspot near Naples yesterday after residents tried to force their way out through a police cordon. About 700 residents in 4 tower blocks in Mondragon have been ordered to stay at home since Monday after 43 tested positive for the virus. It says many of the people living in the blocks are Bulgarian migrant workers who pick tomatoes and are understood to be concerned about losing their jobs." Now, what are we seeing? Italy, some other countries, are using what we would call the China model for dealing with this crisis. The model of the lockdowns, the model of, say, these strong government, totalitarian measures to control the outbreaks are really part of the Chinese Communist Party's model for dealing with this. The CCP is trying to export this model as the valid and most, effective way of dealing with the virus. We're seeing otherwise now. You might remember in a recent episode, we actually showed data saying that, say, in the US, for example, states and areas that had less, say, totalitarian lockdown measures seemed to have done better when it came to dealing with this virus than the states that had more restrictive lockdowns. In Italy, they're using the CCP model, at least in a lot of areas. And with the moving in of the army to deal with it, we see that, to enforce the lockdowns. Now, moving on, Trump is turning to the Supreme Court to eliminate Obamacare entirely. Just the News reports that DOJ filing, Department of Justice, says the law has illegally limited consumer choices, raised costs, and should be struck down because the individual mandate requirement on the healthcare issue is unconstitutional. And now on that note too, this was part of Trump's 2016 campaign, where he said he was going to get rid of Obamacare. It appears that he is moving forward with that ahead of the 2020 elections. Now, a bit on what's happening in Seattle. You might remember we talked about how they're getting rid of this CHOP site, this Chaz site, whatever you want to call it. The Chaz site is locking down, they're doubling down. Many protesters and rioters are saying they're not going to move from that spot. But the Seattle City Council seems to be moving forward as well with its own agenda when it comes to, for example, de-policing. And they're looking now to drop loitering laws on drug trafficking and prostitution. Now, a bit of analysis on this. This is part of the broader push in the United States to reduce policing, right? One of the ways to fight crime is to make crime illegal. So, for example, we saw this in New York. They say they've been reducing crime. They reduced crime to some extent by making laws less restrictive. And in New York City, for example, they're also talking about legalizing things like prostitution. And that said, too, New York, where, say, police have taken a pretty big blow, we're seeing a major uptick in violent crimes, including gun crimes. Also, in other news, Trump says if areas do not want to pull down statues, they can go through legal processes, and the statues can be removed and kept elsewhere afterwards.
And we can take things down too. I can understand certain things being taken down, but they ought to go through a process legally, and then we take it down, in some cases put them in museums or wherever they may go.
A bit of analysis on there as well. Now, Trump is passing an executive order to protect U.S. states and landmarks.
I think that we're going to have a very strong executive order, but we already have we have the Monuments Act already, which means 10 years in jail. But I think we're going to consolidate various things. We're going to come out with a very strong executive order, and I should have that by the end of the week, which is fast approaching. We're going to have it very powerful statement.
And also in the U.S., people who have pulled down these statues are now facing prison sentences, not just going forward, but also previous cases of that. And so Trump is moving forward to protect these statues, but is also showing some leniency, at least in that statement, that if they really want to take down these statues, they can use legal methods to do so. Now, moving on to Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party is being accused of taking actions that are undermining Hong Kong autonomy and going back on the agreement where Hong Kong is supposed to be under this idea of one country, two systems. To understand what's happening on the ground there, we're going to be speaking with Michael Yon. He's a war correspondent and was also one of the journalists who was there during the Hong Kong protests. We'll jump into it now. Hey, Michael, great having you on Crossroads.
Well, it's great to be back on. I'm in Chiang Mai, Thailand tonight.
Yeah, and I understand you're in Thailand because they didn't let you back into Hong Kong. Why don't you briefly tell us what happened with that?
That's right. On February 5th of this year, 2020, I tried to re-enter Hong Kong after I had left for a few weeks, and they denied me entry. You can see it in Time magazine. It got picked up quite widely and deported me, or as they say, denied entry. It's clear that they didn't like the work that I was publishing.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting now what we're seeing with Hong Kong, because the Chinese Communist Party just put into place, it's trying to put into place at least, these new national security laws, and also the local government there is really siding a lot more with the Chinese Communist Party. Now, we had at Epoch Times reporters in Hong Kong, and what they had told me, and I'm curious what you think about this, but let me explain it first. They had told me that basically the protests were initially about this extradition law, but it had extended to become about the overall influence of the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong overall. And they were worried that Hong Kong was going to lose its autonomy. And now with these new laws, I mean, it's on the surface now. Everything they were afraid was going to happen seems to be happening. What's your take on this?
Absolutely. Their fears have come true. And they realized this not just last year, but even before that if they didn't make a stand now, that they had no chance whatsoever. And so they put great effort into getting international partners involved, especially the United States. And they did get quite a lot of support from the United States. That's why people like me actually went over there. And so although we've put a lot of pressure on China, you can see that's made little difference. They just took a bite out of Nepal, China did, face up with India right now, obviously always facing off with Taiwan and many other people. So, they're definitely going to take a bite into Hong Kong.
Now, in addition to the national security laws, they've also put into place this national anthem law, where people can be arrested, even face prison sentences if they insult the Chinese Communist Party's national anthem, even making kids in schools sing the national anthem of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, according to some of your sources, I mean, how is this going over in Hong Kong amongst the protesters? What are they talking about when it comes to these things?
It's going over very poorly, as we can imagine. This is why, they could have more than 1 million people on the streets more than once, up to 2 million in one protest. And that's not a big, Hong Kong's not very big, just over 7 million people, and you can still get, up to almost 2 million people on the streets at one time. That's really amazing. And so now we see their fears are apparently were all correct. And they don't want to be forced to learn Mandarin instead of Cantonese. They don't want to be forced to learn from textbooks that are written probably in a basement in Beijing somewhere, remaking history. And so this is it. I mean, now I think a lot of Hong Kongers are down to a moment of truth. What are they going to do?
Now, and on that note too, what you're saying is actually accurate. I mean, totally, because we know that in addition to all these other laws, they've also had new teacher standards where they're exporting the Chinese Communist Party's form of education into Hong Kong. So, bringing teachers from the mainland into Hong Kong, including the textbooks, and so teaching them a new history and teaching them new standards. Actually, another note too. Part of the, say, concession process to try to make Hong Kong people happier during this time is the CCP announced it was building some housing projects, but it's putting the housing projects in the mainland. Just from what I've heard, this is being taken as kind of, why are you building Hong Kong housing in the mainland? And if this is being seen as some of that breaking down of the boundaries between these two countries that are supposed to remain separate to some extent, one country, two systems.
Right.
What's your take in terms of how this is being interpreted as well there?
Oh, they're clearly moving to absorb Hong Kong completely and utterly without caveat, and way ahead of the schedule that they agreed to years ago with the UK. It's just not going to happen. That they never abide by their promises. lies are what they do. Of course, they lied about SARS-1, they lied about this virus, and, huge things that caused significant amounts of loss of life. They just perpetually lie. Look at Three Gorges Dam right now. I mean, that thing could break tonight and we could see a dramatic change in China. Maybe Hong Kong can be free if that dam breaks. We'll see.
And now I guess it's kind of the bigger picture of what's happening right now. Where do you see this going? I mean, you were on the ground with these protesters. You knew a lot of them. You're still in touch with a lot of them. Where are things going now? I mean, is there hope for them to go out and protest again? CCP is using the virus to prevent that from happening to some extent.
Protests aren't going to do much good anymore, I believe, especially because most of the other countries in the world are looking inward. The United States has our own severe problems.
And I guess, Michael, just last question. In terms of what you've seen, in terms of what you're currently hearing from Hong Kong on the ground, are there any things you feel that people are missing when it comes to understanding the situation in Hong Kong?
Well, they're the most educated protesters I've ever seen anywhere in the world. And I've been in protests and in wars all over the world. I've never seen somebody fight so well just with their minds. The Hong Kongers are very good, let's say, Jedi mind trick fighters. They're incredible. The Hong Kong protests, they're at their wits' end. They're more than frustrated. They're beyond that. They're obviously fearful that CCP is going to disappear. Huge amounts of peaceful Hong Kongers that might be 18 or 20 years old, but they were at a protest. We may never see them again. We need to get them out and get them to the United States if they want asylum.
Great. Hey, Michael, real pleasure having you on the show.
Always great to come on, Joshua.
Great. Now, where can people find your work also?
Well, I just set up a Parler account because, I don't think places like Facebook and Twitter are going to allow me too much longer with the sorts of things that I say. But I have a Twitter account. It's just my name, Michael_Yon. And then my Facebook, just look for my name and my face and you'll see it.
Great. Hey, thanks again. With that said, folks, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, really need your help supporting this channel. Also, we'll be broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, so please tune in. That said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, stay safe. We'll see you next time.